Okay. Hey, welcome everybody. It is 10:30 on the dot. We are going to go ahead and get started. This is a third session brought to you by ODE. My name is Adam Amater, and I will be your facilitator. And this third session is sort of follows two other sessions that were done. One was done yesterday, which was really an orientation to the power of inquiry. And then just this morning, we just finished a session with Ryan Susky and Lauren Colley around gaining a better understanding of inquiry. This third one's called Don't Reinvent the Inquiry Wheel. And so now we're going to take all this great learning, and as educators, we're going to get after it together and find out how we can actually do this in these amazingly challenging times. Before we get started, though, I do want to thank you for being here today. And I mean that thank you very, very intentionally. Ryan and I were just before we got on, we're having a conversation around the idea that what you're doing is you're trying to bring real learning and real understanding for your students to get them to really step up and critically think and analyze and learn and grow as a person in your class. And you being here means you're taking the time because you're trying to juggle all these many, many things, not just with your school, but in your own life. Because right now, we don't know what everybody's going through. Lots of people have real challenging problems in their lives. And you being here, well, it's just a big thank you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for just getting after it and trying to continue to evolve and learn and grow to help your students. So just some quick housekeeping as we start. The goal of this is to build your capacity, to build our capacity for implementing inquiry. And there are some assumptions built into this roughly hour session. We're going to try and save time, maybe 20 to 30 minutes at the end of the session for Q&A. And also, even if it's not a question, even if it's the sharing of how you implement or how you plan on implementing, we think that would be very helpful for all of us. But there are some assumptions built into this session. The first assumption is, there's going to be this digital delivery for many, many educators across Ohio. And whether it's face-to-face, digital delivery, or some hybrid, we want to recognize that this session is going to be built around the idea that you could be delivering this digitally. However, this learning, growth, and development could easily transition if it was a face-to-face setting. So there's that assumption is built in. The other assumption, time. Time is an issue even in regular times. And Ryan and Lauren talked about that in the last session, how sometimes, we think this doing inquiry can be challenging. And if you're in a remote setting, time can be a deep issue here. So, the assumption in this session is, how do we be as efficient as possible and delivering inquiry for students, and your planning time. That's going to be very challenged this fall as you're planning and trying to keep up with everything that's going on in a remote setting. Another assumption that's going to be built into this hour is, we really want to stick to what is the essence of inquiry. And Ryan actually described that in the last session. The visual we got to see was Picasso's, like the essence of a bull. And then Ryan transitions that into the essence of inquiry. And while we want to maintain the essence of inquiry, but we also want to try to do it in a way where there's a smaller footprint of time, that's more manageable, especially with students learning remotely and teachers, and everybody's trying to do this kind of for the first time. And the last assumption today is, what you see today, whether you're an expert in inquiry or you're a novice in inquiry or anywhere in between, the assumption built in is it's probably a good idea, instead of developing your own inquiry, is to start with some pre-made inquiries, some that are already made where there's, not that you have to do it this way, but it's one of the good strategies you could employ is taking inquiries that are already made and modifying them so they fit this new footprint and these new variables that you're under. And still, it's still the essence of inquiry. You're still building capacity toward really high quality development inquiry with you and your students. So those are the big assumptions as we go into this. One other housekeeping piece, I have to thank the people that you see on the screen right now. I had the pleasure of being part of sort of a planning team, and I have to tell you that learning from these folks who have tremendous expertise around inquiry is a real joy. My learning is, evolving around inquiry. So I really do need to give a big shout out. Just listening to the conversations as they unpack, the ideas about how inquiry should look. And now that it's remote, if it's going to be remote, what would that look like? And just being a part of those discussions, really learned a lot from these people. So, so I just want to make a big time shout out, especially Art Lewandowski, who did the first session, and Ryan and Lauren, who did the session this morning. These are just really amazing educators. And I feel like we're always learning more, and I'm always getting pushed by people who care about my growth. So I'm very grateful to them. So we've got some big goals today, right? And by the way, if I go super fast, you're going to throw it in the chat. Art and Ryan are going to help us with that. They might have to slow us down. They may chime in at certain points as well to clarify and help us understand. But we're going to probably go pretty quick through some of this stuff. And by the way, we're going to be circling back around over and over a lot of this stuff, which will be helpful for you. So don't get lost in one thing and say, because we're probably going to cycle back to it multiple times. But the big picture here of this hour together is efficient and organized steps to support inquiry in your classroom. How are you going to do this? Where does the rubber hit the road? How do you get started? Whether you're a veteran and you've been rocking this for a while, or whether you're new to this, let's face it, everything's going to be new and a bit different and a bit up in the air this fall with our kids. What are the best practices? What are the most promising practices as we move forward? Where do I go first for resources? What are some sequential steps in this process? What do I do first? What do I do second? How's this going to look different in sort of this remote, shortened reality where the footprint of time and the footprint of understanding might be a little smaller, to say the least. And then if you did attend the session 1 with Art, or session 2 with Lauren and Ryan, you're going to see that work be revisited and synthesized into this session. If you did not attend those sessions, that's okay. Highly recommend when they come online that you can go and peek at them. ODE, Linda will have them somewhere for us. But you're also, it's okay because those ideas are going to get, those ideas actually shaped this session, and they will be embedded throughout. So you'll hear me refer back to that, and that's why. I have another disclaimer before we start. This is not my ideas. This was Swan's and Lee's. As I took this from their Summer Institute. They like to say that technically reinventing the wheel is a key component of inquiry, and it has inherent value. You know how they say don't reinvent the wheel? And you know how the title of this is Don't Reinvent the Inquiry Wheel? Yeah, technically reinventing the wheel is a really important part of inquiry, not just for your students, right, but for you. As a teacher, working through, doing the intellectual work to work through a compelling question and then sort of, stress testing it and working through ideas of where connections could be found in sources. And that's a big part of the inquiry process. So technically, we do want to use ready-made stuff because we want to launch. We want to launch with kids quickly. We want to launch with sequential steps that are low risk and high reward. However, be mindful that inquiry is all about intentional and thoughtful thinking around ideas. And even if we're using ready-made ones, we still want to do that. Ryan got to talk about this morning the idea of a structured inquiry and a focused inquiry as a couple of sort of the way the IDM sort of defines their current definitions. You have multiple definitions of different kinds of inquiries. And the structured is that one that might be a little longer. Ryan liked to say longer than a lesson, shorter than a unit. But we also saw what really could be considered a focused inquiry this morning, and around some primary sources about Native American assimilation, which, by the way, Ryan, I'm totally stealing that. We are absolutely stealing that, but these are much shorter, right? And there's using the IDM process that Lauren and Ryan described this morning. There are lots of structured inquiries that are already made, that have been vetted, that are very, very good. There's not as many focused inquiries on the site where I'm going to show you. Are some. And like Art said in the beginning, where anything can be inquiry, right? Anything. And the notion of creating a shorter, smaller, more focused inquiry, we don't need the IDM for that, right? We can do that, although it still informs us and helps us with those structures, okay? One of the most important things, though, is the ownership of the learning still has to be with the student. The student has to kind of make decisions about what is important, or what is the source telling me, or how do I like the essence of inquiry with Ryan. I at some point I still really need to make that argument with sources, right? I have to demonstrate, hey, I've got some evidence to back this up. So we still want to do those things as best as we can, even though what I'm about to show you is we're kind of cutting some corners here a little bit for the notion of starting with students, because we want to get them on the same page. We want to be successful. And we want you to start this as soon as you can with your students, okay? So the model today that we're using is 4 steps. Identify first, if you were looking to do this remotely this fall with your kids in a few weeks, you might say, well, my first step is, what are the main resources that I should be looking at to support inquiry? And then how do I build capacity with my students so when we do this, they're going to be successful? And then as I decide on and find an inquiry in the IDM, the IDM model that's pre-made, how do I get it so it supports my learning goal? Where do I start? How do I narrow that focus down so I can do this with my kids successfully? And then in the last maybe 10 or 15 minutes of this session today, we're going to actually talk about just kind of organizing some steps in which to deliver these, okay? In the chat real quick, though, could you, based on what I just described, could you put in what do you predict or what do you think of these 4 sort of steps that we're going to review? Which one do you think for you personally is the one that is going to give you the biggest challenge? Like as of right now, which one, and if you could put in the chat, I think so-and-so, I think which of these is sort of the most challenging for me and why? Yeah, the delivery is going to be tricky, no matter how we slice it. With everything being new, delivery is going to be tricky. Yeah, the focus really is tough because a lot of these inquiries in the IDM banks they're really big, they're really daunting. So narrowing the focus is for sure can be really tricky. Okay. Yeah, ESL students, whether they're EL students, or how about all the students? How about students with an IEP? How about just the students in our class that sometimes they just need that extra support. So that delivery piece digitally is going to be tricky. Yes. All right. So there's somebody who does need resources. Well, that's good because you've all come to the right place. Let's get on with the first one, which is which resources should I look at first? You got to promise me you don't get stuck in these, okay? Hopefully Ryan and Art put the tiny URL in the chat, and hopefully you have this slideshow, okay? But when you go and start investigating these, trust me when I tell you, you are going to want to go to each of these maybe for, after this for, a good 15 or 20 minutes. But if you get lost now, you're going to miss what to do with them. So, try to stay disciplined and not get sucked in too far. But let's look at some of these resources. Obviously, here's the C3 framework link, right? Art introduced you to that. Ryan and Lauren dug into that and showed you the different dimensions there. The IDM at a glance is something that Ryan and Lauren introduced you to, right? And we don't have to go into too big of a detail on this because we're going to circle back to it. However, what I'm recommending right now is start with a pre-made one from this IDM model. And all of the IDMs that you're going to get to see that are available, they follow this blueprint, okay? Start with a compelling question, and indeed it's aligned to something, and there's a staging of that compelling question. There's supporting questions, the task, and the sources that Ryan and Lauren went through. And at the end, there's a summative task and taking informed action. All of them follow this blueprint. I like this link because it tells you exactly what each of these are, right? So this will be helpful for you. If you don't know them all, don't worry, because we're going to be circling back to this in just a few moments. Here's the link for the actual inquiries. We're recommending that one thing you could do is actually select a pre-made a pre-made one that's already been made for you, and it will have the stuff that you can then scaffold for students much quicker than you doing it yourself, making your own inquiry, finding your own sources, making sure there's question logic in the supporting questions, and all these other things, right? Just take one, pull it, rip it, and use it, okay? By the way, the OCLRE also has some killer awesome resources. And shout out to Ryan Susky, because you owe it to yourself to go through these. And again, I'm going to be bitter with you if you go here right now and you dig into one of these and start looking at it, because you'll be blown away. And then you'll spend the next hour looking at Ryan's inquiries that he's made with his teachers, and then you'll miss all this stuff. So you got to have discipline. You go back to this a little later. There's some really, really good stuff in here, and they're building more all the time. This IDM generator, by the way, and you do need to join for this, but it's free. And I should have been logged on. I forgot to log in, but I've already done this. But there are more inquiries in the generator. There's inquiries that they've posted, and you can search for them and find them, and they've got a lot of them up. But if you're a part of this generator, then there's even more. You log in and you get to see even more if people have made them public when they've done them. But that's kind of the next step for you. And then this Right Question Institute is a great tool for just in the realm of getting questions to kids and having them think about adding their ownership to their learning. So totally want to ask you to go to these first and sort of think through these as you're finding inquiry supports, okay? By the way, I've got some other things down here for you when you dig deeper. If your school district, by the way, has Gale resources, it's a paid subscription, by the way. It's not free. In Akron, we've got a couple of their banks, and they have really, really good primary source collections. They're vetted and curated. So as you're digging deeper and you're trying to create your own, that might be something to look at. But there's lots of commercial products, and frankly, there's really good through .edu. A lot of universities have created organized primary source banks, but again, a lot more work to dig in. And then if for you power users who are building your own, you'll see the link at the bottom around supporting your own, creating your own template, right? They have templates that you can riff off of. Another piece, sources before we get started. Okay, before we get started with the kids, we've got to plow the field, guys. We've got to lay some serious groundwork. In here, you've got some really, really good stuff. There's the 4 steps to reading like a historian. These are prompts that you can be using for students. Do you do them all? No. The primary source analysis tool is the tool that Ryan referenced in the last session. That this is something you could almost use. You just pick your format. It's going to be a political cartoon that they're looking at. And I've got some questions here that it prompts the kids, and they can type it in, they can do a response, and then they can send you this. So I can get kids analyzing sources very quickly. This building community, I was telling Linda and some others before we started, this will link you all the research and ODEs in their general sessions yesterday laid this out as well. You have to build a sense of community with your students in a remote environment, or you will get nowhere. So it becomes literally the foundation. It is the foundation that everything else will be built on. You have to do that first before really digging in with kids, or I should say it could be in concert with, right? That'd probably be a better way of saying it. As you're building capacity with your students, one of the first things you're going to be doing is building sense of community. That slide changed yesterday or 2 days ago. It was not linked 2 days ago, and it said, I need to defer to the experts. The other people will give you expert advice on how to build community in your social studies classroom. That has changed. That is linked to facing history and ourselves. Their 2020 COVID back to school toolkit. It is absolutely phenomenal. They took their back to school toolkit that prior to which kids learned about their individuality. They learned about expanding their definition and understanding of what a community is. They developed a classroom contract, and they understood, got a deeper understanding around how all voices are important in the classroom and how we don't judge each other and how we help each other communicate. They've transformed that in this 2020 version for actual digital activities. You got to go to it. Once again, don't go to it now. Start digging in because you'll be lost for the next 3 hours. It's really good. If nothing else, go there today, okay? And then Facing History also has this is pre-COVID, so this is not digital, but they have some really good ideas around building civil discourse. You're going to want that because in a digital environment, we're going to want to make sure we have this classroom community set up and kids are sharing and they're sharing appropriately and in the ways we want them to, okay? So between the actual IDM resources, right, these inquiries, pre-made inquiry models, and these historical thinking and civil discourse and building community tools that we need to start with. We absolutely got to start with. Ask yourselves these questions. How comfortable am I with these resources? Because after today, step one, if you're a veteran and you've done this stuff before, you're going to be like, you know what? I really just need to refresh, especially the Facing History, their back to school toolkit, their 2020 school kit toolkit. I just got to refresh with some of this stuff. If some of this stuff is new to you, though, absolutely, this is first step stuff. Okay, be mindful that I'm recommending that when you do this with kids and you start launching with this with kids, everything really is going to need to be modeled in a remote environment. So you're going to have your screen up. You're actually going to kind of follow that old I do, we do, you do model with more of a gradual release, right? When we're analyzing a primary source, we're going to do it together first. Again, I'm going to circle back to this, but that's kind of the big picture of if you're asking, how do I deliver this with the kids? Don't take any shortcuts. Deliver directly. Have them think about it. Practice it. Practice it with different sources, like something in the news, a current event. You can go to all sides. You can introduce them to all sides so they can see the different types of ways we organize media bias, and you can start pulling out some of current events and say, hey, let's practice let's practice analyzing the source. And that would probably be the move. By the way, pro tip, consider recording all your meets, or if you're using Zoom or what have you. In Akron, we're using Google Meets, but consider recording those, especially when you're modeling how to read like a historian, how to use, analyze primary sources, analyzing that, building sense of community, looking at definitions of community and having students analyze them together. Consider recording everything because number one, what if somebody missed it? And number two, how are you going to do intervention? And there may be really powerful ways where you can take a video clip, put it in an ed puzzle, snip it down to its essence of the bool, like Ryan would say, and hey, let's have students really, really focus in on this. Instead of doing it 5 times a day. And then, if you're like in Akron, we're going to be kind of live remote. And, I deliver this 5 times a day. And then I find out tomorrow that a third of the kids didn't even see it. And I'm going to have to go back. So pro tip there, consider recording everything. All right, gang. Okay, this is a time for a group chat, actually. And I thought it was on there, but I guess I'm not. Now that we have looked at these first 2 blocks, what are my main resources that are going to support inquiry? What are my main resources that I should go to first to build capacity in that remote classroom before we start digging in with inquiry? I got to build some capacity. Now that you've seen those 2 in the chat, which one are you thinking in your practice you need to learn more about? Which one do you think is going to be more impactful in your own practice in terms of, hey, this is one of my big takeaways from the first step or the second step that I think is going to be important in my practice? Could you share that in the chat? Because before we move on, we kind of need to reflect on each other's learning and see where everybody's at with that.
Adam, could you repeat your question one more time?
We just finished looking at the main resources of support inquiry, where they're at, where we should go first, and historical thinking and civil and academic discourse skills, what those resources are, and how we're going to build capacity with kids before we start. Which of those 2 steps do you think you need to kind of focus in on a little more, or you think might be really most critical to your next steps as you're going to be developing inquiry with your students this fall? Good question, Ruth. It's not going to be as difficult as you think to modify these resources. So you're as usual, Ruth, because you're such an amazing teacher from Akron Public Schools. You're down the hall and around the corner already. But we are going to be able to modify these IDMs, these inquiries, and that's coming up actually in the next sort of block for us, which is called narrowing the focus. So a lot of people saying building capacity, and it's going to be hard to do with kids, isn't it? It's hard to build capacity for civil discourse and building community face-to-face, having that safe, trusting environment for students where they can talk about things in a non-judgmental environment, where they have the discipline to make sure that they're not treating others inappropriately. It's going to be a lot harder in a remote environment. And I couldn't agree more that the room seems to think that building the capacity is going to be tough. And we just got to, like Kathleen says, we just got to plow that field, man. We got to get kids going. I'm telling you that Facing History Back to School 2020 Toolkit, you guys are going to dig all over that. They give specific activities, and it's digital activity or how to build community. Oh, great point, Jackie. There's going to be frustration, right, for the teacher and the students. So just even building their capacity to know that each day it's going to get a little better. Each day, we're going to learn from each other. Each day it's going to get better. Great ideas in the chat. Let's move on, gang, and talk about our third thing. I've got these inquiries. How do I narrow my focus so I can do this in a truncated reality with less time, smaller chronological footprint? How do I do this? We're going to focus in this IDM model. We're going to be focusing on 3 big pieces in this next session: questions, tasks, and sources. And What you have in front of you is I picked out an actual example that we can look at together from the IDM. It says 10th grade enlightenment. In Akron, we do our world history in 9th grade. This for us is a 9th grade world history. But we do the enlightenment, and I'm sure most people around the state in high school world history start with the age of absolutism and the enlightenment. And I always pick world histories for my examples because there's so many more U.S. history examples. But here we go. I got one here for you. And we're just going to focus first on these questions, tasks, and sources. But I really do need to do a couple disclaimers on this slide. And the first disclaimer that I want to tell you is what I'm about to tell you is a way to modify this pretty large, let's call it a 3 to 5 day structured inquiry. We're going to try to modify this so the footprint is much smaller, less time. And when you start with students, you'll be starting with students step by step. So it's low risk, high reward for the students. So the students get the bigger picture. What I'm about to describe to you is not the be all and end all of inquiry. It's a great place to start. But to do these inquiries in their totality makes a lot more sense. And for those of you who are familiar with these IDMs, should probably make sense to you that doing them in their entirety makes a lot more sense. The other disclaimer I should tell you is not all of these inquiries that they've made, not all of them are created equally. Some of them are better than others. For example, in this inquiry, it says the compelling question is, how did reason lead to revolution? And a best practice would be to rename this compelling question to, did reason lead to revolution? Take out the word how altogether. So there's a lot of benefit to learning more about Swan and Lee's, to learning more about that IDM model and all those resources I gave you for how to build inquiries and that Ryan and Lauren gave you. That's why reinventing the wheel is somewhat of a bad analogy. We want to learn how to do these well. And so some of them are, you'll say, I wonder if that's right, or I wonder if I could do that better. And as you should, that would be a good practice to have that critical eye. So there's some disclaimers, but we got an enlightenment one. What a great one, because, in Akron Public Schools, world history, 9th grade, we would be starting with something like this, okay? So you've had a chance to look at that, and there's a lot going on here, right? There is a tremendous amount of work going on here. This is not an easy lift in regular times at the beginning of the school year. This is not an easy lift doing it remotely, okay? All right, so let's start with that first topic, that first idea, which is questions. All of these inquiries that are pre-made, which much easier to adapt and use right away, all of these there are questions. Ryan and Lauren introduced us to, in the last session, about a compelling question at the beginning and supporting questions. When you find a pre-made inquiry that's already made that you think might have value for your kids, the first thing you want to do is look at the compelling question and the supporting questions, okay? And you're going to want to see, is this going to fit for me, for my students in my class? When you read the compelling question, by the way, the authors of this IDM model, they like to talk about, there's value when you make these of stress testing the answer. And that's just a fancy way of saying, answer the question in all the different ways you think kids would answer them, to see, sort of, to gain an understanding of what types of pathways would the question actually lead kids, and do I think those pathways are worthy of understanding? Because hopefully there's more than one pathway. And after you kind of read through the compelling question and sort of stress test it and say, yeah, this is something that is pretty good, because we're going to come back to this at the end. We're going to come back to this at the end, but yeah, I can see some value there. Then what you want to do is you're going to be looking at these supporting questions. And I'm recommending today, you're only going to pick out one. For those of you who can't do that, 1 to 2. But for the first one with kids, go ahead and just pick out one. Take a quick peek at them, read through them. But when you do this, you really, really should check your standards first, because one of these questions may align best with the real learning goal that you're trying to hit. With the content statement or its elaboration, one of these may jump out and you might be like, oh yeah, that's exactly what they said in the elaboration of the content statement. I'll pick that one. That's 2 birds, 1 stone. So it's actually a shortcut if you check your standards first, and then you kind of look through these and you pick them out. By the way, and this is some learning I got from Ryan, I'm being mindful that one of the things in the IDM is these supporting questions, they sort of follow a question logic. There's usually something at the beginning that sort of frames the information. What was the Enlightenment? What were the Enlightenment writers' views on human rights? And then it kind of jumped, well, if you know that, then what would be the next idea that logically you'd want kids to know about? And then after that, and then at the end, sort of, what would be the one that would logically really connect back to them making an argument and backing it up with evidence for this compelling question? So if I had to pick one out, I wrestled between question 2 and 3. But being an old school dude, now, I'm an old man now. Like, I just shaved off like this super great beard that I had, and I got a kid going to college now, and I'm feeling really old. And so I wanted to go old school. So I picked supporting question number 2, because I'm going to be honest with you, when I taught high school social studies, I always started with themes anyway. And those of you who've done the DBQ project, you know about how DBQ puts these you're constantly putting different sources in buckets, right? Political bucket, social bucket, economic bucket. So I thought, hey, that's great for the beginning of the school year, right? So in my practice, I might pick 2. Totally get why someone might pick 3, though. And if I was going to do 2, I might start the kids with 2 and 3, right? Or 1 and 2. It's up to you, right? But the first thing is questions. The next part of the model, though, that we need to get to is tasks, right? So we've got these supporting questions. We picked them out. Now look at the tasks. If I'm going to do supporting question 2 with the kids, this is the task that they're going to do. They're going to match Enlightenment writers with social, economic, political problems pointed out in their writings. So again, it's kind of like that old DBQ project. Again, they're going to start organizing this information in buckets, which is a great way to do it. So I'm going to look at the task and find out what is it that they need to know in order to do the task. In this case, I better make sure my freshmen know when we talk about social, economic, and political problems, that we have a shared understanding of what's political versus what's economic versus what's social. So I linked you there, something we've used in Akron Public Schools for a long time, just the notion of teaching thematically and common understandings around those themes. And by the way, as I'm doing it digitally, I can have a formative check in there where kids can go to a Padlet. I could have them, I want to test and see if you can do this. Find something in the news for me, a current event. Tell me if it's political, economic, or social, right? I could do this digitally and practice this digitally. So I'm actually doing a piece of inquiry and building that capacity at the same time. And so that's why I said, man, maybe almost this building capacity and using a pre-made IDM actually works it could actually work in concert. You definitely got to plow the field first. You definitely got to get it ready before you start sowing the seeds. But perhaps building capacity, you can actually do this, and it'll just get better at each inquiry as you model and do that gradual release. Okay. The third part is the sources themselves. And that's the beauty of these IDMs, these inquiries. They've already done this. They've already linked this stuff. Just click on it and it's already been curated for you. That's going to save you a lot of time. It's going to save the kids a lot of time. Okay. So really like the idea that these sources are curated and aligned to the task. And by the way, the task is already aligned to the supporting question. By the way, remember that site that Ryan brought up? You could take those sources and they could pick one, right? And they could actually drop it into this and do this and then send it to you. So again, you're actually building capacity around analyzing primary sources while you're doing this. And again, would you do that first? Nope. My recommendation is do it together. Model and coach the students for these first few times so everyone's on the same page. And frankly, I would recommend absolutely recording along the way. Okay, so now that I've narrowed my focus, right? I've picked out an inquiry I like. I've read the compelling question. I've seen its staging. I kind of get the gist. I've looked through the supporting questions. I've found one that I'm digging on that I like. I can test it with the kids. I can check and build their capacity to do this one supporting question with its aligned sources, right? So now we've gone through 3 of the 4. Here's my question for you. Are you ready? Use the chat, my new friends. Of these first 3, which one's going to be the hardest? Which one's going to, the most challenging? Which one's going to be sort of the easiest for you? After this session today, you're going to get started. And in the first few weeks of school, you're going to get them going with one of these inquiries. Which of these 3, now that you know what you know, which one's going to be the hardest, most challenging? Which one do you think is going to be easiest? You see, and you're feeling like, you know what, I got this. Is it identifying those main resources, really understanding those main inquiry resources? Is it the building capacity with the historical thinking and civil and academic discourse? Or is those steps that we just went through about narrowing the focus, taking an IDM inquiry and actually getting it down and finding which supporting question you want to use and looking at those sources, trying to make sense of it. Man, we got a lot of chat going on. I'm digging that a lot. There's a lot of good ideas in here too, right? Kathleen, putting it all together. Good. So Jackie's like, hey, I can identify these sources. I got that going on for me now. The capacity. So it hasn't changed, Jackie, I believe. Boy, Jackie said something. Jackie, maybe you were in the last session, and Jackie said, boy, you thought that just even how to get started, how to put it all together was going to be a challenge, maybe, if I'm thinking of the same person. And so building capacity for learners. Building capacity. James says building capacity. Man. Here's a compelling question. Should building capacity be the most important of these 4? I've organized this into 4 blocks or whatever, 4 steps. Should building capacity be the step that is the most concerning? And, I made the argument earlier that building that sense of community and developing those historical thinking skills with kids is absolutely critical. But it's going to be okay. I mean, you're going to go into the toolkit. You're going to find great ways to build capacity with kids, to build sense of community, and it's going to be great. I haven't observed everything in the chat. Is anyone also concerned about building capacity with kids that don't show up? How do I build capacity with students who don't show up to my class or don't do my, what I have prepared for them? I think that's going to be a big challenge too. Ruth, narrowing that focus. Students need a lot of practice, right? So Ruth, do you want, when you narrow yours down, do you want to do one supporting question or do you want to do two?
There we go.
Man, we got some great stuff.
I'm going to actually start with one, and I like what it said, where you start with the question, then it goes, you work your way down. I think my kids can do this because I did the Start Soul last year, and it was fun, but I think this is one step better. And I'm going to, it's going to work. I'm going to look at government later, and then see what I can put in.
Good.
So,
and just so you know, Ruth is in Akron Public Schools. Ruth takes some of our students who have the greatest need. These are ESL, these are EL students. Many of them are refugees that we have welcomed into Akron. And Ruth is absolutely a rock star in terms of helping these kids out. So if Ruth is saying with her EL students that she's going to jump into this, man, we all have to tip our hat and say that we can do this. So that's
and
really
take
cool.
myself too. That'll be fun.
Right. That's right. Okay. So we got to jump into the last one because I really do need to save time for our questions and share out, which is our group that did this really believed in. So we're winding things down, right? How do I deliver this? So fine, Adam, you got me going. You got me into sort of a scaffolded piece of where to start and where to go. But how do I actually deliver this, right? What's going on? Here's the big slide that I want you to kind of, print it out or something, or take a picture of it with your phone, or share it, because you're going to be sharing this. And when we get finished, it'll be very interesting to hear your share out, your thoughts as you look at this. But delivery steps. Be mindful that for inquiry to be successful in what we're suggesting and using these pre-made inquiries, you initially, when we start out, got to build community with the kids, develop protocols around civil discourse, orient them to some historical thinking ideas, how we look at sources, and whatever your main learning goals are for your unit, you're going to want to know what those are so you can identify one of those pre-made inquiries that kind of fits into those main learning goals. So that's kind of where we want to start. And then, before we actually get started with the students, really want to read through the compelling question. We want to practice they call it stress testing. And we have different terms for it. Many of us would call it range finding answers. Most teachers would say, just answer the question and find out, all the different directions it can go, right? That's the stress testing of that compelling question. But these inquiries, they also have that staging where you don't just ask the compelling question, but they give some documents or some ideas about that you would front load with the kids so they have an idea. In the Enlightenment one, by the way, I believe they read, I can just flip back to it real quick. They're going to discuss the concept of inalienable rights. How did reason lead to revolution? And let's discuss the concept of inalienable rights as seen through these sort of thinkers during the Enlightenment. And see, so it's a great way to stage before we get started. You know, the kids, hopefully, one of the very first questions they're gonna ask, or you're gonna ask, is, what does inalienable mean, right? So you're really giving them some context in which to look at this compelling question. And so we're going to practice this compelling question and that staging, kind of read through it, make sure we understand it, make sure we can help students understand it. By the way, we're going to do that with them together, by the way. And then I kind of need to decide what the instruction is going to look like before we get to the supporting question I picked out. Because what if I didn't pick out the first supporting question? There's probably some more information they're going to want to know before we look at the supporting question that I want to do with them directly. So I kind of got to decide what some of that instruction might look like. Is there some direct instruction? I have some resources I want to independently look at. I'll front load, and then maybe the next time I see them, we'll actually debrief that together. Maybe I want to actually have them look at that information together. You know, we're going to use a remote jigsaw, or I'm going to put them in breakout rooms like Art did for us in the first session. By the way, Meets is coming up with breakout sessions. So I'll put that in the chat later. Somebody gave that to us yesterday. If you're here today, if you would link that blog site again, there's some really cool stuff that Meets is coming up, right? But so there's some good digital stuff in there. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I got it, Adam. I can give it to you.
Beautiful, thank you. So I got to decide sort of what the instructions are going to look like before and after we do this. Those are the steps we got to do first. Now we're going to deliver with the kids. And we're going to deliver directly. First step, kind of model how to orient to the compelling question, its staging, and the supporting question that we're going to do. We're going to do that first, right? Then we're going to model / teach the skills, the vocab, the concepts that are in the compelling and supporting question that we have. Again, I do, we do, you do. That is low risk, high reward in the beginning of a year. This is the first time, with the exception of those teachers who are on with us right now who have actually always done remote learning with kids. For everybody else, this is the first time we're starting the year. So this is kids we may not have met before, and we're starting remotely with them. I'm going to model and coach how to read that compelling question, how to read the staging and look at the sources together, how to read the supporting question and come to common understandings about what the question's asking, how to model our historical thinking skills around the sources that will inform the supporting question. It's already done for us, but I'm going to model all that directly with them. And if I'm being clever about it, I'm probably going to record it, because what if I have kids who aren't there? Or what if I want to take it at a later time, put it in Edpuzzle or snip it in such a way where I can say, there's a 2-minute video of me explaining the 3 questions you should always ask. I always want you to ask when you look at a new source, or something like that. Okay? So these kind of, inquiry does not sit well with check boxes, right? But if you are going to use a pre-made inquiry to save time and to reduce the footprint of complexity, and you are going to use that pre-made inquiry in the IDM, and you are going to focus it down and just start with one of the supporting questions, or maybe 2, right? Even though this is a checklist and inquiry doesn't sit well with checklists, these are probably the boxes you want to make sure you are either working with the kids on, or you have a substitute or a better way of doing it than this, which hopefully we're going to have better ways than this. And by the way, whatever the task is, this is a great example to go ahead and look at the task, right? To look at the actual task and then decide what's the best app, what's the best digital tool I could use for this. And by the way, Padlet would be really good for the one I picked because they now have topics. Like a student could make a Padlet and make one column economic, one column political, one front, so that app may lend well to this task. Maybe it's something different though. Maybe you want them to actually use a Flipgrid or actually write it out in a Google Doc and send it to you, or maybe there's something else you want them to use along the way. Maybe you want them to all do their own Google form where they match stuff up and you can get that feedback and that data and whatever it is, whatever task works best for you, right? That's a great way to handle that task completion. And then the most important thing, and I have my friend Art to thank for this, is, and this is where it gets a little sketchy, okay? So don't yell at me. But maybe one of the most important things after they look at the sources and complete the task, let's go back and model directly the compelling question. Now that you know what you know, did reason lead to revolution? What evidence do you have to support your claim, your argument, right? And here's where it gets tricky, because in order to really answer this, it would really help if students had the understanding from all 4 supporting questions. Remember the question logic that goes with this? And we didn't do all 4 with them. We only did 1. But there's great value in having them go back and really look at this compelling question again. Even though, it's not the true summative assessment that you would see in this framework, it's really important that you get them thinking about that. They could still make their own argument to the compelling question. It may not be that super awesome summative essay or whatever, because they didn't see all of the supporting information, but it still could be an argument. Maybe it's an exit ticket. Maybe it's a graphic organizer. Maybe it's just something, a little more general, but we don't want to skip that step. I have Art to thank for that. It's really not inquiry. It really becomes just more stuff if we don't at least get them thinking again. And by the way, this isn't the be all and end all, right? Over time, they're going to be able to tackle more supporting questions because you're building that capacity, right? This is, how do I get started in a digital world in a remote setting when I have less time with the kids and everybody's under a lot of stress, and I just need to find a good place to get started that's low risk and high reward. So I bolded that because there's great value in doing that, okay? So our hour's almost up. My hour is actually up. We have some more time, but I really want to save it for Q&A. There are a couple things I'd be remiss without saying. This framework in following the C3 model, it doesn't just have a summative argument at the end of each inquiry. Also wants to promote the idea of taking informed action. And I put the definition on there for you so you could see what their definition of taking informed action is. And I really want to recommend and encourage you to do this, even if it looks a little different right now. And in this kind of box over here, I have some questions here. What about the larger current context? I swear to you, I didn't even think about this when I picked the Enlightenment. I swear to God. But I mean, obviously the Enlightenment fits in anything. Like it's the easiest thing to connect to anything you're studying. But what about the larger current context of inalienable rights? Are there any current events that could connect to that? Right? Is there action that could be taken, or real world? And those who are smarter than I, they really talk about one of the most powerful things you can do when kids bring social studies alive is have them do something within their community, where they can try to make a difference in their community. And the other piece that I wanted to share with you is, it'd be really hard to get started this school year with doing one of these and then having them maybe do direct action, which they could, but there's nothing wrong with starting with one of the steps along the way, which is a call to action. If you were going to make a call to action based on what you know now, what should your classmates, what could they be doing? What should they be doing with this new knowledge? And then we've got some remote tips down there at the bottom as well. Even if it's just having a discussion, right? But taking informed action is absolutely, you don't want to skip. That's because that's cool. And that's why we dig social studies, by the way. And that's why we're cooler than everybody else. And for those of you who are visiting and not in social studies, we're like the mob, you're part of the family now. So you're part of social studies. So I do have some finishing up pieces though. And you've seen these in all of our ODE presentations. If you want to be a part of that social studies learning community around inquiry, this link will get you there. So you're not on the hook for anything. You just, hey, I'd like to learn more about this. I'd like to be a part of this community. If you're someone who, and we have some people in the room today, if you're one of those people who really has written some inquiries and done some work around this, we'd love for you to join as well. Here's your survey, right? A special thank you for Linda McKean. We are blessed. We have a really good social studies consultant at ODE. So big time blessings to her for coordinating and organizing all this. And there's her contact information. If you liked these sessions, you can email her. And then if you didn't like these sessions, you thought they were horrible, you can email me because I'm kind of used to that. And look below that for upcoming August 18th and August 20th. Some really cool sessions there for us to look forward to from Linda. So with that, I need to turn it over, and I'm going to open up our chat. I need you to turn your mic off if you want, and I need you to start talking to us. And what we're really looking for is your analysis of this session. As you get started with your students, is there anything that jumped out at you at this session that it's going to help you focus on? And also, for all of us as participants, what else could be different? This is just one way. Maybe you could say, hey, here's another thing that I'm going to try and do. I think that would be super beneficial for everyone that's joined today. So with that, I will turn it over to you guys. And I'm very grateful you're here. Thank you very much.
Well, Adam, this is Linda, and I'll jump in right now and say thank you so much for your kind words, and I'm going to hire you to do my introductions everywhere I go now. So thank you so much, and thank you so much to Adam and Art, Ryan, and Lauren for sharing their knowledge, sharing their time, sharing their insights, and making our whole social studies community better and stronger. And I appreciate the time and the effort that you have shared. And I look forward to where this group is going to go from here. So, and thank you to everybody who has joined us for these sessions. But I don't want to take all of this time. I want to hear some more feedback from you. So I'll be quiet and listen some more. So thank you.
Ruth here. I want to say thank you. I was looking for something to add into my online learning to make it more engaging for the students. And I think this is going to, it's like a stepping stone. You give them the question and they keep going, they keep going. And like I said, my kids are great at discussing and asking questions. And this is a great way to get them to actually think about what's going on. And I think it's a nice, comfortable setting. It takes a while for my ESL kids to get comfortable with asking questions. So I think this is great. So again, thank you. And thank you for the all the extra sheets and help them how to modify things. And I'm sure, Adam, you'll be in one of my classrooms, I'm sure.
Again, this can be something that really jumped out at you today that you think is powerful, or something that you think will help add to our discussion about how to get started with this. Kyle, go for it.
So I apologize going in and out today. I had my administrative duties today going back and forth on some of these sessions. I happened to have a chance. I didn't get to attend the IDM Institute with Kathy and Swan and others, but I did get to hear her talk during a session with one of our textbook training virtual environment symposiums recently. And I was going to share a document in the chat for everyone that everybody has access to. It is how to do inquiry online through Zoom. They actually broke down with C3 how you maybe do some of these breakout sessions and how you use Zoom and some of Google Hangout techniques to do some of those supporting questions. So everybody will have access to that.
Thanks,
So
Kyle. Dang it, Kyle, where were you a month ago, 2 weeks ago? We were trying to figure this out. Thank you. That's awesome.
I was actually attending this right here with Kathy.
Well, and to build off of that too, right? I mean, I think it's just a good reminder that we're all still working to figure this out, right? There are certainly novel challenges that the current remote teaching has brought up. And, even the authors of the C3 framework are working through what this could look like. And what's really cool about this, this document that Kyle just shared that Kathy's been putting together with her colleagues, they start giving you other tools for your toolbox, right? So they talk about Pomodoro method in this article, right? So, as we're thinking about like, gosh, how do I manage an online classroom? How do I manage inquiry in the online setting? They're reminding us that, look, there's already things out there that work for this, right? So Pomodoro is a method that you can use to be more productive in your work, where you have set times of work, break, right? And you segment out your productivity to, get more done in less time, right? And the online setting is very much about getting more done in less time because you have a lot less face-to-face time with your kids. So it's a good reminder to us that there are things out there that we can continue to share with each other to build through, our efficacy in this. And, we were having this conversation earlier before the meeting started that we're looking for a lot of stuff right now to solve online challenges, but all this stuff is still good in the classroom too, right? Pomodoro is a fantastic way to manage online learning, but it's also a great way to manage a classroom in the real world. Inquiry is a fantastic thing for our students in the classroom, and it also works online. So don't feel like you get to throw away what you know about good teaching just because we're changing some paradigms, just because we're changing the medium through which we instruct our students. Still lots of great stuff out there for us to work through together. Definitely seeing a lot of really good, confidence in the chat, which is phenomenal, right? This is about not just capacity building for our students, but capacity building for ourselves. I said this in the chat, but I really want to emphasize it. Like, give ourselves the grace and forgiveness to know that we're not going to be experts at this right away. Just like our kids won't be experts at this process in the beginning, we're learning. And it's such, a freeing and liberating activity to be able to say to our kids, I'm not sure, or I'm still working through this myself. I'm getting better at. And just being really deliberate with the way we talk about practice and improvement, right? I would say to my students sometimes, hey, I'm working on blank, right? Like, I'm working on my explanations today. So can you give me some feedback later on if you feel like I explained things well or not? We can say to our students, hey, today I want to focus my practice on, going slower through a source. So can you help me practice that? In the same way that we expect them to practice, we can kind of all embrace that idea of continuous improvement and just give ourselves the grace and permission to try new things and be bad at things at first.
Can I interject, Ryan, real quick?
Yeah, please.
Something that I'm a K-12 coordinator for Dayton Public Schools, so I have a little bit more to say sometimes what happens in the classroom. And if you are a teacher per se in the classroom, maybe isolated or anything like that, a lot of it sometimes is a matter of bringing these ideas to your department. And I was a department head at one point where you had to kind of push. You'll have those pushbacks of, well, I like to lecture, I like to do some of these things. So when you bring the inquiry model in, it's a hard adjustment for some. And I think some of the great resources I know in the slides as I was going through in this presentation, Reading Like a Historian, if you use any of those, some of those are great setups to inquiry and idea of how to script it even and how to ask questions and go through those supporting questions, because they already actually have a model set up in a lesson plan where I'm going to do primary source A, guys, you're going to do B, but I'm going to show you through modeling in primary source A as we compare the two. And I think that, again, going into the idea of that, there are segments of inquiry and blueprinting in the most recent book with Kathy and her team that don't feel like you have to do those open inquiries to start your year off. I think that any time when I introduce it, especially as I'm trying to vertically align at Dayton Public, the vertical inquiry is going to be, yes, you can still do it in kindergarten, third grade, fourth grade. It's not going to be as complex, but you can still get the questioning and foundation in the C3 framework as you look through the progression of learning and critical thinking. Even if they do one a quarter, going into what Ryan, I think you guys did in your presentation, looking at the vertical alignment, try to do the focused inquiries early on. So as much as it may take a year or two as the kids progress through the system, in a socialized classroom, if a district or even just as a building, you can see the more adaptive nature of the kids towards that kind of thinking in a socialized classroom. And it took a couple of years, for the kids to get used to it. But then you'll get that. I used to do it in a high school setting, we got to do this again, but they know what it is, and that's the difference. And as you train them and model this, it'll become quicker and easier to do throughout a district or a building.
That's true. That seemed to be, I felt like I was telling you guys in the beginning, I was on this rock star team. Like, I was on this, it was really cool. I was with all these amazing people, and that was one of the common themes that you articulated very well, Kyle, that over time, right, kids get better at this. They do. Ryan and others kept saying, yeah, but you have to start because, it's going to constantly inform student learning over time. Can you imagine, and this might have been a private conversation at some point, but can you imagine students in high school where they've been taught with inquiry their entire lives in social studies? Can you imagine they would be creating inquiries. They would be, it would transform so much. And we don't always live in that education reality, but at the same time, like you said, Kyle, when we do it, it becomes part of, they know how to do it. It becomes part of what they can do.
I want to shout out a question that came from the chat. So Dave asking, want to ask a silly question? Definitely no silly questions in this process, right? So thank you for putting this forward. What happens when you make and stress test a good, compelling question, but instead of narrowing the focus, you expand the focus? Does this change the impetus of inquiry? And I think it's a really cool way of kind of starting to think about this process that, Lauren was talking about in the last session, where inquiry can scale, right? It can be a single lesson. It could be a course. It could be as big as a statewide standards framework, right? So if you're looking at this idea of taking a compelling question and instead of narrowing the focus, you expand the focus, now we start getting to where we think about how do we arrange our courses around central compelling questions, right? Like arguably, you could teach a high school government class with the overarching compelling question of who has power in a society, right? Like power becomes then the lens through which you explore all of the content. And so rather than kind of making it messy, asking big questions like that actually helps to give context to each of the smaller questions you tackle along the way. And so it starts to show students that they really never run out of questions to answer, right? And they're just expanding their views on these larger questions as they learn more and more and more. So there's absolutely nothing wrong with expanding your focus. You just need to start thinking about what are the smaller pieces then you tackle along the way, right? You give your students supporting questions or smaller compelling questions that nestle into that so that you know what you're doing tomorrow, right? Because one of the challenges that can come from this, one of the things that starts to feel so overwhelming is when you just think about big questions, the challenge for a teacher becomes, well, what do I do on Monday, right? Like, what does my lesson plan look like for Monday if all I have in mind is this big, huge question? So the narrowing is what gives you your day-to-day, your lesson by lesson. The expanding focus gives your students context and relevance for your class as a whole. And shout out to Jackie, right? Preschool kids do it better than the college classrooms. Amen, right? Before our students have had that curiosity kind of beaten out of them by that dialectic instruction, they're really good at inquiry, right? Because they're used to asking, things that come from their curiosity.
So I'd like to add into this conversation. First, Ryan, that was a really good explanation of narrowing focus versus expanding focus, and how I think you kind of intimated that narrowing the focus would be more conducive to standards-based learning, universal understanding by design, but expanding focus might give your class more relevance. That might be something you do later in the year when you don't have to worry about standardized testing. I'd like to ask Dave, whose question that was, do you have an example in mind?
No. So I'm not really an educator. I pretend to be an educator, but I'm a classical historian. And I wonder and worry about that narrowed focus tends to lead people into preconceived conclusions. Well, World War II happened because of, or the Civil War was fought over the economics of slavery, and they just automatically box it and say that's it, and there's no more discovery. So when I'm thinking about teaching my high school students, I think that keeping that realm open to where there's a possibility of all the voices being heard is better than narrowing the focus to this conclusion or to this supporting question, and they end up reaching this predetermined destination. We want them to reach a destination, but we want variance in the destination that they reach so that their voices can be heard. And we want to give credit to all those voices being heard at that, in that process. So I worry about that narrowing that focus down. And I purposely, when I write my inquiries, I make sure that my supporting questions lead them to another open-ended box so that they have to decide which side of that box are they going to walk out of and what's going to be the next thing that they move to. And
So I think what you're doing in that process, right, is exactly what needs to happen, right? So I put in the chat, but I think there's a difference between narrowing the focus and narrowing the viewpoint, right?
Exactly,
So
yes.
the ways in which the dimensions fit together. We said that you stress test a question by looking at the argument stems, right? Can
Correct.
a student answer yes, no, maybe to this question? Or, it's not always yes, no. Sometimes it's A, B, or C, or all three, right?
Right.
But the next step then becomes, even if students could answer the question yes, no, maybe, have you provided sources that empower that?
Exactly.
And so
yes.
as educators, right, and this is my challenge I see a lot with DBQs, right? So like I use this example where I loved this DBQ back when I was teaching middle school students, and they had fun with it too. The question that the DBQ asked was, why are rivers essential to civilizations? Right? Which seems like, oh yeah, that's so cool. Like you could answer it in lots of different ways. But notice the assumption baked into that DBQ is rivers are essential. And so if I've assumed that out in the beginning, the sources the students will get will only point to civilizations that support my conclusion that rivers are essential. And so now we're going to leave out, for example, the Anasazi people of the American Southwest, because, well, they didn't have a river, so must not be a civilization. And so we start baking in these preconceived notions and evaluative judgments that we can get away from if I had just stopped and asked the question out front, can students say no, they're not essential? And if they can say that, have I given them sources that allow that? Right. So, it really is about like looking up and down your inquiry, right? Not just about writing a great, compelling question, but writing a great, compelling question that then helps you find sources, that then challenges, what you give your kids. So there's lots of back and forth in this process. And that's why we say that the dimensions are recursive, right? They're looping. So you're constantly going through and reevaluating to see if you've supported students to really make the question compelling.
Right. Yeah, totally agree. 100%.
Rob, that's a great question about state testing, right? Does state testing demand a narrowed focus? Yes and no, right? So we start looking at this idea of, yes, of course, there is an end goal that students have to meet according to the state assessment, right? But the state standards and the state assessment don't say how students need to reach that point. So what we start seeing is there is a component we have to include in our inquiries that is that mandated content, but we get a chance through the inquiry process to make it stickier for students in their memory, right? So in the last session, we showed that inquiry about education as a fundamental right. Students, according to the state test in government, have to know that amendments and court opinions have changed the Constitution over time, right? But it doesn't say what amendment they have to know that changed that process, or it doesn't say what court opinion they have to know. And so we can start kind of bringing in other ways to remind students and make it more memorable for them, so that on the state assessment, when the question comes up, how has our understanding of government changed over time, they can think back to, oh, wait, we talked about education equity. And that brought up for me Rodriguez, right? The Rodriguez case looking at education equity, right? And so they can pull from their toolbox because now it's more memorable. So it's a narrowed focus in terms of the content they need to master, but the inquiry allows us to make it more interesting and memorable for kids. Johnny, yeah, great question. What happens when certain notions, judgments are generally considered historical canon? So there's general historical consensus on a lot of things, like the cause for the Civil War. So I think this is where that authenticity comes in, right? So we said before that when you're asking questions and building sources, you want to look at what are people in the field actually talking about, right? So like if it's settled historical fact, so for example, it is settled historical fact that Thomas Jefferson has descendants that came from his relationship with Sally Hemings. Like there's no dispute on that anymore. Then creating an inquiry that asks students to challenge that assumption just is very inauthentic, right? So we want to look at where is there still space for tension? Where is there still space for discussion and disagreement or reevaluation? The assumptions that historians make about certain things become rich territory for students to challenge preconceived notions, or to look at how it fits into modern paradigms, right? So, there's settled historical fact on when certain periods began and ended, but it's not settled fact to ask, are we still seeing echoes of that today? Or did we learn from that process? By reshaping your question, you can still allow students to pursue settled historical fact in a manner that allows for tension, discussion, and deliberation.